Within the gilded walls of Buckingham Palace, a document has surfaced that could change the royal family forever. King Charles has recently uncovered a hidden clause in his mother's will, one that directly impacts Prince Harry's inheritance. The contents of the late Queen's estate have shocked the monarchy to its core. The morning of November 23, 2025 began like any other in the private offices of Buckingham Palace. King Charles sat at the familiar mahogany desk where his mother once handled her most delicate affairs, surrounded by leather-bound books and centuries of royal tradition. Yet, what occurred in that room over the next hour would send unforeseen shockwaves through the House of Windsor. Charles had asked for a thorough review of his mother's estate documents. More than 3 years had passed since Queen Elizabeth's passing in September 2022, and certain legal matters required ongoing attention. His senior legal counsel, along with the keeper of the Privy Purse and 2 trusted advisers, had gathered for what they expected to be a routine briefing. The king, dressed in his usual dark suit with reading glasses perched on his nose, prepared for what he assumed would be tedious but necessary administrative work. The leather portfolio containing the relevant documents opened softly on the desk. Page after page outlined the distribution of assets, properties, and heirlooms exactly as Charles had understood them. The main provisions of the will had been executed according to protocol. Balmoral, Sandringham, the private jewellery collection, all had been allocated and transferred as expected. Charles had seen these documents before, or so he thought. With hands steady despite their age, Charles broke the seal. Inside, the paper bore his mother's unmistakable handwriting. But this was not the graceful penmanship of her youth. It reflected her final months, slightly shakier yet deliberate. The date at the top read March 15, 2022, just 6 months before her death. His breath caught as he read. The room fell silent. Advisers watched as their king's expression shifted from curiosity to surprise, then to something deeper. A mix of emotions flickered across his face, trained to remain composed in public. But this was private. This was a son reading his mother's final thoughts about another son, the one who had left, whose absence had left a lasting wound in the family. The document contained a clause, carefully detailed and legally binding, concerning Prince Harry's inheritance in ways that contradicted everything Charles had understood about his mother's intentions. Or perhaps, it revealed wishes she had intentionally kept hidden until now. Even in death, the Queen was thinking ahead, protecting her family in ways they might not grasp until the right time. Charles read the passage 3 times. His legal counsel confirmed the document was authentic, properly witnessed, and legally enforceable. Its validity was unquestionable. The only question remaining was how to proceed. The clause did not merely allocate money or property. It set conditions, stipulations, and a framework requiring decisions, discussions, and perhaps a complete reassessment of Charles' relationship with his younger son. An advisor cleared his throat, breaking the silence. They needed to know the king's wishes. Did he want private time to reflect? Should they start preparing briefing documents? Questions lingered, but Charles focused on his mother's words, written in her final months with the awareness that her time was short. Charles set the document down, removed his glasses, and pinched the bridge of his nose in deep thought. He pictured his mother in her study at Windsor, composing these words in secret, instructing that they remain hidden until the right moment. Had she imagined this moment, her eldest son discovering her hidden wishes and deciding whether to honor them? Of course, she had. Elizabeth had always thought everything through. The weight of the crown felt heavier than usual. Charles inherited not only the throne but his mother's responsibilities and burdens. Yet he had not anticipated inheriting a family dilemma wrapped in legal provisions designed to compel action. This was exactly what lay before him now, a choice, or rather, a test. Would he honor his mother's wishes even if they complicated his plans? Or would he interpret his duty in a way that served the present rather than the past? His advisers waited. The mantel clock ticked steadily. Outside, London carried on unaware that inside these walls, a discovery had been made that could reshape the House of Windsor. King Charles knew there would be no turning back. His mother's hidden clause had been revealed, and now everyone would face its consequences. The clause specified an inheritance for Prince Harry that was both substantial and conditional, highlighting the complexity of the late Queen's intentions. The provision allocated approximately £20 million from her private estate. However, it was not a simple gift. The inheritance came with requirements reflecting the Queen's careful consideration for her grandson's future and that of the monarchy. The first condition was clear: Harry would receive full access to his inheritance only if he maintained certain connections to the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. The Queen's instructions were precise. He was required to spend at least 90 days per year in Britain or Commonwealth nations, engaged in work supporting charitable causes or initiatives benefiting communities across the realm. This did not require a return to royal duties. Elizabeth had been pragmatic. Yet, she demanded that Harry stay meaningfully connected to the world she had served for 7 decades. The second provision concerned Harry's children, Archie and Lyot. A portion of the inheritance, around £5 million, was specifically allocated for Harry and his children's education and upbringing, but with certain conditions. The funds were to be managed by trustees approved by both Harry and the reigning monarch, ensuring that Charles would have some oversight in the process. More importantly, the Queen stipulated that the children spend meaningful time in the United Kingdom as they grew older, with the intention of maintaining their connection to their heritage and family. She had written that her great-grandchildren should not become strangers to the land of their ancestors. Most notably, there was a personal letter attached to the legal document, written in the Queen's own hand. It was addressed to Charles, meant to be read when the clause was discovered. In this letter, she acknowledged the challenges surrounding Harry and expressed understanding of the anger, hurt, and sense of betrayal felt by many in the family. However, she also wrote something that revealed a deeper, more personal perspective. She reminded Charles that Harry remained her grandson, and his children were still her great-grandchildren. She could not leave this world without making one final attempt to ensure they would not be completely lost to the family. The letter included a request, not a command, but rather the hope of a mother and grandmother nearing the end of her life. She asked Charles to consider that bridges, once burned, can sometimes be rebuilt, but only if both sides are willing to provide the materials. Her inheritance clause, she explained, was her way of offering those materials. What Charles and Harry chose to build with them was up to them, but she wanted them to have the financial and emotional resources to make the effort. The legal team confirmed that the clause was airtight. The Queen had worked with her most trusted legal advisors to draft it, ensuring that every word was carefully chosen to withstand scrutiny and make her intentions abundantly clear. This was not a suggestion that could be easily ignored or reinterpreted. It was the will of a queen, but more importantly, the will of a mother and grandmother who, having run out of time to fix things herself, refused to stop trying, even in death. While the sum of money involved was significant, it was not excessive by royal standards. Elizabeth had been shrewd enough to realize that too large a sum might raise questions, make Harry seem as though he were being bought, or fuel media narratives about favoritism. £20 million was enough to provide genuine security and opportunities, but not so much that it would overshadow the true purpose of the provision. That purpose wasn't about money, it was about connection, about family, and about preserving the bonds that had been strained, but not completely broken. As Charles read the document, he could almost hear his mother's voice. The phrasing was unmistakably hers, practical yet emotional, firm yet hopeful. She had known she was dying, and that the situation with Harry would soon become his responsibility. She left him this clause, not just as a tool or a burden, but as a hidden plea, one last attempt to keep the family together even as she prepared to leave it behind. To understand why Queen Elizabeth included this hidden clause in her will, it's essential to consider the evolution of her relationship with Prince Harry, especially during the turbulent years following his decision to step away from royal duties. The Queen had always held a special affection for Harry, a bond that those close to the royal family had noticed since his childhood. His irreverence and ability to make her laugh reminded her of her own younger years, before duty had transformed her into the epitome of protocol. Harry and Meghan's decision to step back from royal life in January 2020 had taken the Queen by surprise. Sources close to the palace at the time said she was hurt and disappointed, not because Harry wanted a different life, but because the announcement had been made without prior consultation, putting the institution in a reactive position. Still, even in her disappointment, those who knew her well said that Elizabeth's main concern was Harry's well-being and future security. The Oprah interview in March 2021 had made matters more difficult. Allegations of racism within the family, accusations of a lack of support during Meghan's mental health struggles, and suggestions that the royal family had been cold and uncaring, these all wounded the Queen deeply. She was the embodiment of the institution, and criticisms of it felt personal. Her public response had been measured, and included the now famous phrase, "Recollections may vary," a diplomatic way of indicating that there were differing perspectives on the events Harry and Meghan had described. Privately, however, friends of the Queen indicated that she was deeply troubled by the breakdown in family relationships. What many did not fully understand was that, despite the public rift, the Queen had maintained private communication with Harry. They spoke regularly, not frequently, but enough that the connection had not been severed completely. She made it clear to him, in a way only a grandmother can, that she loved him, despite his choices. She didn't agree with everything he had done, and she didn't appreciate the public airing of family disputes, but he was still her grandson. That bond was something palace politics couldn't fully erase. In her final year, as her health declined, Elizabeth came to terms with her mortality. Those close to her saw a woman quietly arranging her affairs, making peace with what she would leave undone. The situation with Harry was near the top of that list of unfinished business. Over her 70-year reign, she had navigated countless challenges. She had modernized the monarchy in crucial ways, preserved its essential character, and held the Commonwealth together through decades of change. Yet, she could not heal the rift in her own family, and that failure haunted her until the end. The hidden clause appears to have been drafted during late 2021 and early 2022, a period when several factors converged. The Queen's health was in decline. Harry and Meghan had settled in California and seemed unlikely to resume any royal duties. The Jubilee celebrations were approaching, and uncertainty lingered over whether Harry would attend. In this context, Elizabeth appears to have decided that action was necessary, not through public gestures or family meetings, which had proven ineffective, but through the one instrument she still fully controlled, her will. She consulted her most trusted legal advisor, a man who had served her for decades and understood both the legal intricacies and the family dynamics. Together, they crafted language designed to achieve her goals. She wanted to secure Harry's financial stability, removing it as a source of stress or potential embarrassment. She aimed to ensure his children would remain connected to their British heritage. And most importantly, she sought to create a framework that would require Charles and Harry to communicate, negotiate, and collaborate on implementing the provisions' terms. The decision to keep the clause hidden until after a full estate review was deliberate. Elizabeth did not want it to become part of the immediate post-death narrative. She did not want it leaked to the press or used as a political tool during the early days of Charles's reign when he would be establishing his authority. She wanted time for emotions to settle, for the initial phase of grief and transition to give way to stability. Only then, she reasoned, would her provision have the best chance of being received as intended. In a personal letter attached to the clause, Elizabeth revealed the depth of her thinking. She acknowledged her failure to keep the family together during her lifetime and admitted that she might have waited too long to intervene forcefully. She had placed too much faith in the idea that family members would eventually reconcile on their own. By the time she fully grasped the depth of the rifts, her health and the constraints of her position made certain interventions impossible. Understanding the Queen's intentions paints a portrait of a woman who loved deeply, who felt the fracturing of her family as a personal failure, and who refused to accept that failure as permanent. She had weathered countless storms in her long life and believed that family bonds, when truly tested, should withstand even the gravest disagreements. The hidden clause was her final effort to ensure that such a test would not result in permanent separation. Sitting in his private office with the document still in hand, King Charles faced a dilemma that was both profoundly personal and deeply constitutional. The personal dimension was clear: this was his mother's dying wish regarding his son, a child he had loved, worried about, and, at times, been angered and disappointed by. The constitutional dimension was equally significant. As king, his decisions carried implications far beyond family matters. How he handled this information would signal his priorities, his vision for the monarchy, and the tone of his reign. Charles's relationship with Harry had worsened significantly since the move to California. Public accusations, the Netflix documentary, and Harry's memoir, which criticized Charles both as a father and as a future king, had left deep wounds. Charles had spent his entire life preparing to be king, including developing a thick skin for criticism. Yet criticism from one's own son, broadcast to the world, pierced even the thickest armor. The anger Charles felt was real but coexisted with enduring love, creating a constant internal tension. Prince William's reaction was also crucial. The Prince of Wales had been even less forgiving than his father regarding Harry's departure and public statements. The brothers' once close relationship had fractured, perhaps irreparably. William saw Harry's actions as betrayals, not only of the family but of the monarchy itself. He had advised Charles to take a firm stance, to make clear that there were consequences for Harry's choices. The discovery of the Queen's hidden provision complicated William's position and risked creating friction between Charles and his heir. Charles arranged a private meeting with William the following day. It would be a difficult conversation. He needed to inform his eldest son about the clause before making any decisions. William had a right to know. Pragmatically, Charles needed his support, or at least his understanding. If the King and Prince of Wales publicly disagreed over how to handle Harry, it would create exactly the type of family drama that weakened the monarchy and fueled the press. The meeting took place in Charles's private sitting room. William arrived alone, aware from his father's tone that this was serious. When Charles explained the situation, William's face darkened. He listened without interruption, jaw tightening as the details unfolded. When Charles finished, William's response was immediate and sharp. He felt that their grandmother had overstepped. She had no right to impose conditions that would force reconciliation with someone who had repeatedly attacked them. Financial support was one thing, but requiring Harry to spend time in the UK and granting oversight of how his children were raised felt like manipulation from beyond the grave. Charles let his son express his anger. He understood it and even shared some of it. But he also knew his mother well enough to understand her intentions and felt the weight of obligation that came with being her son and successor. She had asked him as directly as a queen and mother could to give Harry a chance to use her final gift as an opportunity for healing. Could he simply refuse? Should he? The question was far more complex than William seemed to think. Their conversation lasted over an hour without resolution. William made his position clear: if Charles chose to honor the provision fully and offer Harry the inheritance under all its conditions, he would not interfere, but neither would he participate. He made no effort to hide that Harry spending extended periods back in the UK was not something he welcomed. If circumstances required civility, he would provide it, but nothing more. The damage ran too deep, the trust had been shattered beyond easy repair. Charles might choose to act as the forgiving father, but William would remain the vigilant older brother, one who had not forgotten the hurt Harry had inflicted on Catherine and their children. Beyond personal family tensions, Charles was also forced to weigh the wider consequences for the monarchy itself. Public opinion regarding Harry remained sharply divided. To some, he was a casualty of an outdated institution, a man who prioritized love and mental health over rigid duty and tradition. To others, he appeared entitled and ungrateful, someone willing to profit from his royal ties while publicly condemning the very family that had given him everything. The reaction to news of a sizable inheritance, especially one carrying conditions that appeared to entice Harry back, was impossible to predict. It might be viewed as an act of compassion rooted in family loyalty. Alternatively, it could be interpreted as weakness, a sign that the monarchy was allowing itself to be manipulated by someone who had already taken much and offered little in return. Charles's advisors were divided on the issue. Those from the older generation, many of whom had served his mother, urged him to honor her wishes immediately and without hesitation. They spoke passionately about duty, respect for the deceased, and the importance of preserving family unity. The younger advisors, more attuned to modern public relations and the evolving image of the monarchy, expressed greater caution. They worried about precedent, about appearing to reward behavior perceived as disloyal, and about the optics of a king seemingly governed by his mother's will even after her death. Late that night, in the quiet solitude of his study, Charles sat alone with his thoughts. His mind returned repeatedly to his mother, to the many moments when she had guided him, advised him, and at times overridden his judgment. She had been the steady constant throughout his life, the guiding star that helped him navigate decades of preparation for the crown he now wore. She had not been flawless. She had made errors. But her devotion to her family was never in doubt, and her commitment to the monarchy had been unwavering. This clause felt like her final instruction, her last piece of counsel delivered from beyond the grave. Could he disregard it? And more importantly, should he? At its core, the dilemma confronting Charles was about identity, what kind of king he wished to be, what kind of father history would remember him as, and whether those two roles could exist in harmony at this critical moment. His mother had attempted to chart a path forward, but following it would demand bravery, forgiveness, and a willingness to endure further pain if Harry rejected the gesture, or accepted it only to fall short of its expectations. The revelation of the hidden clause had not resolved anything. Instead, it had intensified the uncertainty and raised the stakes to an almost unbearable level. Meanwhile, more than 3,000 miles away in Montecito, Harry remained completely unaware that his grandmother's will contained a provision crafted specifically for him, or that his father had only just discovered it and was struggling with how to proceed. Life in California had settled into a routine that was dramatically different from royal life, yet strangely familiar in its pressures. The Netflix productions, the memoir, the speaking engagements, all required constant public engagement, not unlike royal duties, though governed by different expectations and allegiances. Financially, Harry and Meghan were comfortable, though far from as wealthy as many believed. The Netflix and Spotify deals had brought in substantial sums, but sustaining their lifestyle, covering security expenses, and supporting their charitable endeavors required continued income. Though born into privilege, Harry had not inherited a vast generational fortune that would allow him to live indefinitely off investments. He needed to keep working, which meant continuously balancing his royal past with his commercial present. His relationship with his father remained tense. Their conversations were infrequent and brief, typically limited to logistical matters involving the children or unavoidable family obligations. Charles had attended his coronation, but the visit was short and interactions were minimal. Harry had reached out with sympathy and support following his father's cancer diagnosis earlier in 2024, yet the response he received was courteous rather than warm. The emotional distance between them felt formidable and only seemed to widen with each prolonged silence. The conditions tied to the inheritance, however, would inevitably create friction. Requiring Harry to spend 90 days each year in the UK or other Commonwealth nations was no minor request. It would mean extended time away from the life he and Meghan had built in California, and renewed exposure to the British press and the environment they had deliberately left behind due to its toxicity and impact on their mental health. Meghan's willingness to return regularly to the UK was uncertain at best. She had been clear about feeling unsafe there, citing the racism and relentless harassment she endured as deeply traumatic. Asking her to commit to frequent returns could place immense strain on their marriage, strain Harry might be unwilling to risk. The stipulations concerning their children would be even more delicate. Harry and Meghan had gone to great lengths to protect Archie and Lilibet, keeping them largely out of the public eye and raising them in California with American values. The notion of trustees approved by King Charles overseeing funds designated for their education and upbringing would feel invasive, like an attempt by the palace to exert control from across the Atlantic. The requirement that the children spend meaningful time in the UK as they grew older would raise difficult questions: what meaningful truly meant, how it would be enforced, and who would define their connection to their heritage. Still, within his grandmother's provision, Harry might recognize something he had long yearned for: proof that he had not been entirely abandoned, that someone on the other side of the divide still sought connection rather than separation. His bond with the Queen had remained uniquely strong, even at the height of familial conflict. She had offered stability and unconditional affection in ways others had not. Discovering that she had spent her final months attempting to create a path back for him could penetrate the emotional defenses he had built through years of public conflict and personal pain. Meghan's influence on Harry's choice would be decisive. She had been the catalyst, or at least the final push, that gave him the courage to walk away from royal life. Her view of the family was shaped by her own experiences of neglect and targeting. In America, she had helped build a new life for them, forging opportunities and relationships that could be jeopardized by frequent returns to the UK. Her influence over this decision would be significant, yet it remained uncertain which direction she might ultimately favor. Beyond that lay the deeper question of Harry's responsibility to his children. Did he truly have the right to sever them entirely from their British roots, from the royal family, and from any chance of forming bonds with their grandfather, uncle, and cousins? As Archie and Lilibet grew older, would they come to resent being kept at a distance, denied the opportunity to know that side of their heritage? The Queen's arrangement appeared carefully crafted to prevent such an outcome, ensuring that even if relationships among the adults remained strained, the children would still have a chance to build their own connections. One thing seemed undeniable: Harry would not emerge unchanged by his grandmother's final message. Discovering that she had spent her last months thinking about him, concerned for his future, and attempting to create a bridge that could outlast her life would compel him to confront a flood of conflicting emotions. Affection, remorse, resentment, appreciation, distrust, and hope would all vie for control as he weighed how to respond to this unexpected gift from beyond the grave. When it came to next steps, Charles's advisors proposed a blended strategy. Official legal notice would be delivered through the appropriate channels, outlining the inheritance, its conditions, and the steps required to claim it. At the same time, Charles himself would send a personal letter, concise and carefully worded, acknowledging the discovery of his mother's provision and affirming his intention to respect her wishes. The message would neither beg nor pressure, but it would leave the door open, offering Harry the option of dialogue should he choose to step through it. Timing would play a crucial role. The legal paperwork would set a clear window, most likely 90 days, during which Harry would need to formally accept or decline the inheritance. Acceptance would set off a cascade of legal and logistical actions. Trustees would have to be named, systems put in place to oversee adherence to the conditions, and financial structures established for the children's funds. Each step would necessitate communication between Harry's legal team and the palace, interactions that had become rare over the past several years. Declining the inheritance would be more straightforward procedurally, though far more complicated in its consequences. Should Harry refuse it outright, the money would return to the broader estate and be redistributed according to the remaining terms of the will. Public reaction, however, would be intense. He would likely be cast either as a man of principle, unwilling to compromise his independence, or as someone rejecting his grandmother's final act of generosity because it came with expectations attached. Media outlets would battle over that interpretation for months. A more probable outcome, though, would be negotiation rather than an immediate yes or no. Harry's lawyers would almost certainly push for adjustments, claiming certain requirements were excessive or impractical. The mandated 90 days per year might be reduced, or spread across multiple years instead of being annual. Control over the children's trust arrangements might be revised to grant Harry and Meghan greater authority. Although the Queen had drafted the provisions with care, even the most precise legal language allows room for interpretation and discussion. For King Charles, such negotiations would present a profound challenge. How much flexibility should he allow to address Harry's concerns, and how firmly should he uphold the exact terms of his mother's wishes? Striking the right balance would demand more than legal skill or political calculation. It would require genuine insight into his son, understanding what might truly draw him closer and what might drive him even further away. Though Charles had spent a lifetime navigating diplomacy and compromise, he had never faced a negotiation this intimate or emotionally fraught. Complicating matters further was the potential effect on other members of the family, particularly William's children, George, Charlotte, and Louis. As Harry's niece and nephews, they represented bonds that should have been strengthened over time, not eroded by adult disagreements. If Harry were to spend extended periods in the UK once again, might there be opportunities for these cousins to reconnect? Would William permit that, or continue to shield his children from their uncle? The Queen's vision seemed to extend to healing these generational fractures, but turning that vision into reality would require cooperation from relatives who did not necessarily share her conciliatory nature. A more grounded expectation, however, might involve a partial and imperfect reconciliation. Harry could accept the inheritance while resisting the deeper intent behind its conditions. He might satisfy the formal requirements, spending the required time in the UK or Commonwealth, yet remain emotionally distant, avoiding meaningful engagement with family members. Relations could become polite but detached, functional rather than affectionate. This would represent a form of reconciliation, but not the profound healing the Queen may have envisioned when she included the clause. The darkest possibility would see the inheritance ignite yet another conflict. Harry might accept the funds while publicly criticizing the attached conditions, reframing his grandmother's gesture as further proof of control and manipulation by the institution. Such a narrative would be irresistible to the media and damaging to all involved. Charles could be portrayed either as weak for attempting to purchase his son's loyalty or as heartless for imposing terms on what should have been unconditional family support. In that case, the Queen's final effort at unity would be twisted into another weapon in an already bitter struggle. The road ahead was uncertain, littered with emotional traps and practical difficulties. Still, it was more than the family had possessed before. Even in death, Queen Elizabeth had left behind a structure, a framework that made reconciliation conceivable, if not guaranteed. Whether the family would have the will to follow it remained unanswered. Yet for the first time in years, there was at least a path sketched by a grandmother's hand, pointing away from estrangement and toward something that might, eventually, resemble a family once more. The secret provisions of the Queen's will had moved from quiet obscurity into full public view. In Charles's hands lay both a heavy responsibility and a rare opportunity, a final challenge from his mother and a final act of trust. What he and Harry chose to do next would influence not only their personal relationship, but the future direction of the monarchy itself. Time was no longer on their side. Choices had to be made. And across the vast distance between London and California, the fate of a fractured family hung unresolved, balanced between old wounds and the uncertain promise of what lay ahead.